Hello everyone and welcome to this webinar on coordinating to protect culture and biodiversity in the heat of wildfires. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I'm broadcasting from today, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples in Canberra and the surrounding region where I have the privilege to live and work. And I'd also like to acknowledge country all around the nation where everyone is joining us from today. My name is Rachel Morgan. I'm the knowledge broker of the National Environmental Science Program's Threatened Species Recovery Hub, and I'm also bushfire recovery knowledge broker for NRM Regions Australia. And I'd like to particularly acknowledge country, elders past, present and emerging, and recognise any and welcome any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us here today in the recognition that Indigenous custodianship of country has cared for this, the landscapes, the ecosystems and the species in this nation for many thousands of years prior to European colonisation, and that custodianship of country continues to this day and is the great legacy and we all benefit from the great legacy of that care and custodianship in our country today. So I'd like to invite you all now to please introduce yourselves in our chat. This is what we call a chat waterfall. So from you, the audience, we'd like to hear from you, where you're from, what organisation you're from and what Indigenous country that you are joining us here today. It's always lovely for us all to know who's in the room and who's joining us today from different sectors and different parts of Australia and indeed elsewhere as well. So please do introduce yourselves in the chat over the next few minutes while we do these introductions. Today, we'll keep the chat open for just the first little while, and then when we move to hearing from our speakers and our Q&A, we'll close the chat off and focus on shifting to our Q&A button. So for those of you who are used to chats but not used to the webinar functions of Zoom, the Q&A button is near to the chat button, usually at the bottom of your screen or wherever those chat buttons appear on your device, and that will be a great way for you to ask any questions throughout the webinar. We'd really love to get a great conversation going at the end of this webinar. So please do, once we get started, start popping your questions into the Q&A so that we can hear from you. So thank you, everyone. I can start to see those introductions coming through from all around, from Nyungar country, from Bundjalung country, from Ngunnawal country, Wurundjeri country, and many other parts of the nation as well. So please keep those introductions coming, and it's great to see you all and welcome you all here today. So without further ado, I'm going to begin to introduce our speakers. What we're going to do today is have a few speakers tell us about the research and work that they've been doing in different sectors of government and land management and research, and then we'll move on to a great discussion, I think, in the second half of this webinar. So so I'm hoping to foster that discussion with you all here and encourage you, as I said before, to ask those questions and pop those thoughts in the chat that our discussants can speak to later in the webinar. But first up, we have two researchers from the University of Melbourne who are going to be speaking to us first up. So I'll introduce them both and we'll hear from them in turn. We have Kelly DeBee, who is a research fellow at the University of Melbourne, and her background is in looking at social aspects of conservation and decision science with a focus on protected areas and natural resource management. And Kelly will be followed by Libby Rumpf, who is a senior research fellow at the University of Melbourne. She was a member of the Australian Government's Wildlife and Threatened Species Bushfire Recovery Expert Panel, and she's worked on many projects in bushfire management planning in partnership with government and many other partners. And they're going to be talking to us today about a project they've recently completed looking at the 2019-20 wildfires and the lessons we can learn from that on bushfire management planning and coordination. So over to you, Kelly.
Thanks so much for that, Rachel. Hi, everybody. I'm excited to be with you all virtually today and presenting from Wurundjeri country to share our Nest Threatened Species Hub project. So I can share now, Rachel. Yes, so great to be here today and to represent the project team and along with Libby to share this project that we worked on. So the extensive and unprecedented fires of 2019-20 tested the capacity of people and systems to conserve biodiversity. The intensity and extent of the fires resulted in significant impacts to conservation values across the country, particularly with already vulnerable threatened species and communities. While some targeted protection was undertaken before and during the fire event, most actions for biodiversity focused on recovery during the post-fire period. After the smoke had cleared, it was widely recognised that outcomes for biodiversity could be improved if actions to protect conservation assets were proactive rather than reactive. And with large, intense bushfires likely to become more frequent in the Australian landscape, it's critical that we learn from the recent events to develop supporting, planning and decision frameworks that can help to mitigate any future impacts. The 1920 fire response involved a multitude of agencies and organisations with extensive professional and volunteer personnel across the country. The experience of those involved in this massive fire response provides valuable and unique insights into what worked well with respect to conservation outcomes for biodiversity, as well as identifying where the gaps are. So our project aimed to draw on and learn from the experiences and practices of those involved in the fire response across Australia to identify what worked and what didn't in terms of protection for conservation assets. To achieve this, we conducted online interviews with biodiversity managers and fire operations staff from across 7 target states and territory, those areas that had the greatest impacts from the 1920 fire season. We conducted 32 interviews and the questions focused on the pre-fire planning and the fire operations stages, with this viewed as the most critical stages for avoiding and reducing the impacts to biodiversity. A clear result from our research was acknowledgement of the several challenges that the unprecedented nature of the fire presented to those trying to work on the fire response. We heard stories of the fire regularly moving faster than predicted and examples of where targeted actions may have been planned for biodiversity the following day, only to find that the fire had unexpectedly burnt through an area overnight. The capacity and resources were stretched due to the sheer extent of the fire and the subsequent people power needed. Understandably, human life and priority were prioritised, and the resources available were prioritised to protect these assets. However, there were also examples of where opportunities to protect biodiversity were sometimes overlooked or missed. The existence of pre-fire planning was acknowledged as being patchy. While there was various different planning tools available, it was used variably, and overall there was limited ability of pre-fire planning to inform fire operation action on the ground. It just wasn't fit for purpose. Also, a lack of formal prioritisation was an issue, with most jurisdictions not having clear guidance on which conservation assets should be prioritised for actions where it was possible. Data was a common theme, with relevant data on conservation assets not always being available, and when it was available, not being accessible to the right people in the right place at the right time. While most actions for biodiversity protection were taken post-fire, there were also some examples of action before and during the fires that did lead to some successful outcomes. These include some high-profile species like the Wollemi pine and the bristlebird, as well as some less well-known examples. Targeted action could take many forms. In some cases, pre-planning was used, an example being habitat distribution models for threatened species that were able to inform fire operations of species locations and their priority. Planning also facilitated pollination and fencing of rare plant species to support post-fire recovery. During fire, conservation assets were protected through targeted fire suppression, water bombing, sprinkler systems, or dropping of retardants. And there are examples of emergency extraction of species threatened by oncoming fire and the establishment of captive populations to ensure species survival. So what was the key to success? Our research identified several factors. Conservation assets were more likely to be protected when there was a biodiversity representative in the incident management team, who was able to interpret and communicate relevant information. When pre-existing relevant plans were available to inform actions, and in isolated cases, shovel-ready plans waiting to be executed. Strong advocacy for action, either within the incident management team or from broader political interests, external stakeholders, such as zoos, NGOs, and community groups also helped. In other instances, conservation assets were given greater consideration if the fire was located on a national park estate, if the fire was primarily the responsibility of the land manager or the park agency. Additional funding through species-specific initiatives and sourcing of adequate resources, such as additional people power or expertise from stakeholder groups, additional to the fire operations effort, was also an important part of the success of these targeted actions for biodiversity. We compiled the key outcomes and suggestions from the interviews into a series of recommendations that underpinned a roadmap to support planning and action for conservation assets, both pre-fire and during fire. And I'm going to pass over to Libby to run through these.
Thanks, Kel. Yeah, so as Kelly said, the next part of this project was really to take the findings from those interviews and from those experiences and translate them into a series of recommendations that would form part of a roadmap for preparation and action prior to an event, but also for planning and action during an event. And so I just wanted to reiterate really that throughout this project there really was that recognition that fire is a part of this landscape. It's by no means always a disaster, and we are seeing positive signs of recovery, but our baselines for threatened species and communities are shifting and not in the right direction. So really these fires were a wake-up call for being, as Kelly said, more proactive rather than reactive, and doing better to manage these events and their impacts on threatened species and communities. And that's being better prepared to increase the resilience of our landscapes and such that we've got a better chance of getting through these events and getting the systems in place, the planning systems in place, so we know what to do, that we can do it during the actual event. So this first series of recommendations speaks to planning prior to an event, and there's several components here and they're interlinked. So the first message, loud and clear, that we heard is that we need to have a process in place to understand what our priorities are, that they're prioritised going into these events, and so that during the event we're able to quickly go through rapid vulnerability assessment to understand what the priorities are that are at risk. Again, this is a big take home, I think, from this project, is that there needs to be improved planning for more effective actions prior to fire events. So there's high risk in acting during an event, and we can't always act during one of these wildfire events. And so spreading the risk prior to these events, whether that's through translocation, integrated pest management, ecological or traditional owner burning, there's multiple ways to do that. Then it's about having the plans in place such that we're ready to act during one of these events. And so, as Kelly mentioned, these shovel-ready action plans. So they have multiple scenarios of how to act under different fire conditions. They're costed and so on. So we really don't have. There weren't many instances of these plans being ready. prior to this event. And then the last one, of course, is making sure that we have the data for those priorities. We know where they are, we know what their status is prior to the event, and that's really about aiding decision making during an event. Okay, thanks, Cal. So the next, thank you. So the next series of recommendations really it deals with, well, what do we do during one of these events? And so I just wanted to highlight that there are these existing decision-making risk management frameworks that exist for in emergency management, or agencies that deal with emergency management for human life and property. And this isn't about reinventing the wheel. This is about how do we integrate conservation assets into these existing frameworks. So really there's an overarching recommendation here, is that that the protection of conservation assets really does need to be formalised and more effective in the emergency management framework. And so we know, that there's a series of steps that underpins decisions in emergency management. There's the identification of objectives or priorities. There's doing rapid vulnerability assessments to say, okay, well, given the context, given the landscape, given the fire situation, where are our vulnerabilities? Then there's, what do we do? So what are the plans that say, given the circumstances, what do we do? And then there will be a rapid, again, this is all rapid decision-making process of trying to understand, okay, well, which of those actions is feasible given constraints, whether that's resourcing, whether that's safety, there'll be a number of different constraints. And then, do we have to make trade-offs? How do we act? There'll be lots of different priorities and lots of different things that can be done. And are those constraints such that we have to make some difficult decisions there? So thanks, Cal. The series of recommendations that fall under this for how do we integrate conservation assets into a framework like this is, as I mentioned in the previous slide, is understanding what our priorities are going into one of these events. Undertaking those rapid vulnerability assessments means the data and the mapping, so you know where things are. Having those shovel-ready plans in place so that you know how to act in different situations. Assessing feasibility, and this is one, it's tricky, is having those performance metrics so that we can say, if we're going to have to make some decisions about comparing the consequences of what's going to happen for property, infrastructure, conservation assets, how do we measure that? How do we measure those conservation assets such that we can make informed decisions about, what could happen under different scenarios? And in terms of acting, that's adequate resourcing to be able to undertake the actions that are recommended or specified in those plans. But as I said, sometimes that's not possible. So yeah. As Kelly said, the success really was there was having biodiversity representatives in the control room for interpreting information, and assisting that process was kind of critical. And there are a number of, and in terms of data, making sure that those data, those systems are interoperable, so multiple people can access and understand the data, and training, of course. All right, last slide, Rachel, I'm nearly done. So all of this requires support. So, we can have good planning frameworks, but they need support, whether that's legislative or policy support, sufficient funding and investment, national training standards, both for those biodiversity representatives in the control room, but also on ground and emergency control staff. Communication engagement, both within agencies but with the general public, so that we can, explain what we're doing and why. Monitoring is critical, making sure we're, making the right decisions and we're learning from what we've done. And then the last thing, which I think just before I move to Ollie's talk, is, we talked a lot about biodiversity. Well, our project was about biodiversity conservation assets, but we need to start thinking about cultural assets, bringing those things together in these processes and frameworks. So thanks, Rachel.
Great, thank you, both of you, Kelly and Libby. And that's a great segue into our next talk that Oliver Costello is going to be leading us in. So Oliver is a proud Bundjalung man from northern New South Wales. He is, among many other things, the Deputy Chair of the Threatened Species Recovery Hub's Indigenous Reference Group. And he's got a broad range of experience in Indigenous cultural fire practice, in Aboriginal joint management partnerships, in Indigenous natural and cultural resource management, and Indigenous governance. And he's done a lot of work on empowerment, partnerships and recognition of cultural knowledge and practice through community-led mentorship on country. And he's going to take us on a bit of a discussion about what we've learnt, particularly from the recent fires, but also what he's learnt from his breadth of experience on the need for Indigenous voices and leadership in fire management and recovery action. So over to you, Ollie, and welcome.
Thanks for the introduction and the presentations already, Libby and Kelly. Jingle everyone. Firstly, I'd just like to start by acknowledging country. I'm on the lands of the Bundjalung people, the Widjabul people, and I just want to acknowledge this country and my elders past, present and future. Also, just want to acknowledge all our old people. Just want to thank, all the old people, the cultural knowledge holders on country, the ones that have taught me and the ones that have shared knowledge for all these landscapes for time immemorial, that have given us a really strong understanding of our connection to country and opportunities to learn from country and grow our stories and heal land and community. And this is an image of painted by my late stepfather, Billy Yalawanga. He's a Dullabong speaking man from Arnhem Land, and he's painting the brown falcons moving the fire sticks, and an old story that's passed on and older than people, passed on through our ancestors, the birds that taught us fire law for centuries. Just going to talk a bit about the NESP funded project, and it's around participation, Aboriginal participation, bushfire recovery, cultural burning and land management. So NESP funded this in collaboration with CSIRO and Charles Darwin University. I just want to acknowledge Kathy Robinson, Michelle Lockwood, Bettina Pert and Stephen Garnett for working through this. This project was really important, and it obviously was coming out of the bushfires that had such a significant impact across particularly the east coast of Australia, but many parts of the nation. A hugely devastating story, and really important to go out and talk to some community about ways that we can support, or what happened, and ways that we can support empowerment of Indigenous leadership. So a little bit about the impacts, like devastating kind of impacts. This is actually just leading into that season at Jabilan. So this is a reminder that we came off some bad fires the year before as well. And so there's and the 2019-2020 bushfires was just unprecedented, but we've got a long history of fire, and there's been a lot of impacts on Indigenous tenure, and it's really important to learn from Indigenous perspectives, and that's what this project did. Went out and talked to people about those impacts, the effects. Particularly, we were focused on impacts on significant species and cultural places and cultural heritage, and sadly, as was mentioned in the previous report, from Libby and Kelly, that there's a lot of room for improvement in the planning and making sure that we've got really good information about species and heritage, and making sure that we've got people in the room when decisions are being made about where fire suppression happens, where contingencies occur, and what our assets are in the landscape, because sadly a lot of that information is not at hand, and a lot of our cultural significant species and heritage sites were severely impacted by the fires, and we really don't have a sound understanding of all those impacts because there's huge gaps in that knowledge and monitoring going forward. Factors that hinder, as I said, inadequate decision making and resourcing, making sure that we've got that that knowledge in the room, and making sure that knowledge is heard. Current regulatory and legal framework. So there's a whole heap of restrictions that suppress cultural burning and a whole heap of other cultural land management activities that sustained healthy landscapes and sustain people's connections to landscapes. And so it's really important that we work through those regulations. Obviously, some of them are, in there for a good reason because, people are often doing the wrong things on country, but they can also mean that they inhibit people being able to camp and hunt and fish and burn, as they would have done for millennia. And that the impact that has on healthy country is really important. Another key issue is around disconnection with and lack of access to country. So through colonisation, we've seen huge displacements of Aboriginal people across landscapes in a physical sense, but also in a cultural sense as well, that, people have been not able to maintain those cultural practices in areas where they've been able to maintain access as well, because of the suppression of language and cultural practices, as I mentioned before. Also conflicting views around fire, like Aboriginal perspectives have obviously become people have become more aware of Aboriginal perspectives around fire in recent years off the back of lots of great work from people trying to advocate for cultural fire. But we're really kind of little fish in a big sea of, quite strong views from, different institutional and academic frameworks around, and other private sector interests, forestry and agriculture. And, so there's a whole heap of different stakeholders and power brokers in this space that are conflicting views about what appropriate fire regimes. And so, we're trying to, from a cultural point of view, try and get people to understand that, that every bit of country has a fire story, and that might mean that we keep fire over it. It might mean that we put fire in at certain times. And some of the positions that people are taking are not really supporting us to be able to maintain that healthy country, that healthy fire regimes and healthy country. And also fragmented partnerships and burning regimes. So, the kind of Western approach that we've kind of come into, there's all these different tenures, there's all these different agencies, and, it's quite fragmented fire planning. And so, from a cultural point of view, when we plan to burn country, we're looking at cultural landscapes and values across landscapes, and we're trying to burn country for the right reasons, not because there's a boundary here or there's a tenure here or it's different. It's like everyone's working together because they understand their responsibilities to country and to each other's, to kinship and to their neighbours. Factors that empower, so cultural burning in a contemporary landscape. So being able to demonstrate, cultural burning is relevant now and into the future, because there was a long view for some time that cultural burning, traditional fire was something of the past. And because we have, people in the landscape and assets now, that somehow it's different. Well, I would argue that that's just the same place we've always been. There's always been people in the landscape and assets that we have to burn around. That's how we burn country. We understand the values, the significance of species, what's important to us, and we apply the right fire to protect those things or to rejuvenate those things and enhance the habitat and the environment for us to live and connect to. So same thing, might be $1 million, house on top of the hill that probably shouldn't have been built there because that's where the fire goes. But if we implement the right fire regimes and hazard reduction management and appropriate activities, we can go a long way to protecting those assets, but fire is a powerful force, and, we can't always stop it. So we have to make sure we're doing the best thing we can in the landscape to protect and support all those values and assets. Opportunities to build on existing land and fire management partnerships and activities. So there's a whole heap of amazing programs out there, particularly the Indigenous Protected Area programs, Indigenous Land and Sea Ranger programs. We've got a whole heap of exciting kind of Indigenous-led work happening. Increasingly the Indigenous estate is growing. We've got a huge proportion. Most of the National Reserve System is under Aboriginal ownership or joint management. So there's opportunities there to really grow and support. But, there's a lot of work that needs to be done, because a lot of the systems in place are actually reducing the impact of traditional owners being able to implement their practices. And that's the next one, really, is recognising local Indigenous rights, knowledge and cultural authority. So, that empowers people when you recognise that, this is a cultural landscape. These are the traditional owners and the traditional knowledge holders of this place. And we look to them for that knowledge, and we get them in those, planning processes leading into bushfires. We get them in incident control rooms. We get them out in recovery, resilience work. We make sure that we're, recognising people's knowledge and empowering. And sadly, when we look at a lot of the leading to these fires and even a lot of the recovery work, huge gaps. A lot of traditional owners are not being engaged appropriately, and so that's what empowers them. Engage them, resource community, and really work together. Another key part of that is around empowering women as well. We've seen a huge kind of, I think it's a colonial kind of impact the rights of women. You know, traditionally, you know, women and men were equals and had really important roles and responsibilities across country. And we understand that in the relationship to fire, that women and men have different roles in tendering country and looking after values. And by empowering women, we empower a whole heap of other outcomes on country. Another one is sharing, rejuvenating and building knowledge. You know, it's critical. It's critical for everything. You know, that's how we learn. That's how we support each other. And it's really critical that we continue to support that. Another one is around healing country through adaptive local burning and collaboration and reconciliation. So making sure that we're doing, you know, that work on the ground, and we're learning from country, and we're collaborating, and we're creating those opportunities for reconciliation. And I guess lastly, some key issues around training, funding, insurance and employment. Like, we need to resource and remove those barriers, you know, so they're really key fundamental issues, making sure that people have got the right training and experience, mentorship, understand their roles and responsibilities in their country, that it's funded, that we've got, you know, insurance and liability protections around so people can do what they need to do. And obviously, you know, employment is critical so people can get out and do that work. The work led to a whole heap of short and long-term recommendations. And so there's, please go to the Nest website and find the report if you want to get into the detail. But specifically, we looked at empowering Indigenous rights and authority, supporting collaboration and reconciliation, empower and support Indigenous-led bushfire planning and recovery, and empower Indigenous rights and authority to care for country. I'm not sure how I'm going for time, but I think that's kind of enough for me. So, you know, in recap, you know, it's really important that we learn the lessons of this, you know, these impacts in the last few years, and because it's so important that we burn for our future, you know. And here's an example of, you know, my kids and my nephew up on country, you know. And it's, you know, I was staying with my sister on country, and, you know, she's just lighting up the grass and the kids are playing. It's just natural. It's just a part of our relationship to country. It's not a big military operation. It's not something that we have to be scared about. It's about people understanding knowledge, applying it in practice, and supporting that growth so that we can actually help to reduce future impacts of bushfires, particularly in a changing climate. You know, we're going to see climate change and land management issues exacerbate future fires. So it's so important that we learn and grow and support each other into the future. So thank you.
Thank you, Ollie, and those just really such important messages across the board, and we've already had comments to that effect in our Q&A. So that's much appreciated. I just want to remind everyone, I mean, I know that there's people from all sorts of agencies and all sorts of parts of Australia here in our audience today. So please, many of you will have different perspectives on the challenges and the possibilities for implementing these kinds of recommendations and decisions and this thinking into the work that we can do to build better preparedness and resilience, you know, into the future. So please do pop those questions in the Q&A and start them coming at any point, and we'll definitely try to get to as many of those as possible. And also, if others are popping questions in the chat and there are some that are particularly important to you, please upvote those so that they go to the top of the list, and we'll make sure that we prioritise those ones that a lot of you would like to hear answers to. So now I'm going to move on to introduce our next speaker, who is Fiona Fraser. As many of you know, Fiona is the Acting Threatened Species Commissioner with the Australian Government at the moment, and she has a long and rich history working both on country and in government. She's worked with Aboriginal organisations in Northern Australia on community-led caring for country. She has helped to play leading roles in government on Indigenous caring for country, natural resource management and international environmental policy, and most recently, prior to her role as Acting Threatened Species Commissioner, she has co-led the Australian Government's bushfire wildlife recovery response. So Fiona is going to give us some great insights into that national response that the Commonwealth led. And over to you, Fiona. Thank you.
Okay, thanks heaps, Rachel, and Ollie and Libby and Kelly for those presentations. They were excellent, thank you. So I can't see the chat, and I know I was meant to put my acknowledgement of country in the chat, so I'm just going to do it verbally because I can't access it. So I'm in Canberra, and I'd like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people, who are the traditional owners of the country on which I'm lucky enough to be seated today. And I'd also like to extend that acknowledgement to Indigenous colleagues who are on the webinar, and as well, I guess, to acknowledge the enormous and continuing impact of the Black Summer bushfires on Aboriginal land and cultural values, and also on the country of many other people who are on the call today. So for my presentation, I want to talk about the bushfire wildlife recovery response from the Australian government, or the national perspective, and in particular the systems and coordination that were put in place, how science and local expertise underpinned our understanding of impacts and drove some of that decision making. And finally, the importance of reflecting on this experience, what worked, what could have been improved upon, so we can be responding effectively next time, because there will be a next time. So, and look, just to kick off, while it's seared in our memory, just to set the context for some of the national recovery response work, I wanted to give a quick recap of the impact of those bushfires. So the Black Summer bushfires experienced across many areas of southern and eastern Australia actually started in July 2019 and stretched until the end of March 2020. So a 9-month period, with the most significant fire events occurring between around November and February of that year. So the number of fires, their severity and extent, the damage caused to communities, infrastructure and the environment were unprecedented. And the fires shown in this video here, just across the south and east alone, covered almost 8 million hectares. So they came off the back of severe drought, coupled with the hottest and driest year on record. And this served to intensify the fires and exacerbate the impacts to wildlife. And the fire intensity in many places was hot enough to kill trees and seeds dormant in the ground that would normally regenerate following fire. The fires also penetrated into some of our wettest and most lush landscapes. So these are rainforests and ecological communities that are not designed to survive even low intensity fires. So the immediate wildlife recovery response was rapid and coordinated. And indeed, it got well underway while those fires were still burning. And I think it's instructive to run through the early chronology of this to give a sense of what occurred, the incredible pooling of resources, the rapid generation of data, and the early commencement of the on-ground recovery effort, all in a very short space of time and under enormous pressure for those who were involved. And I feel slightly fraudulent giving this because I wasn't one of those people at the table at that point in time, but many of my colleagues, and some of them are on the line, were, and many of the other, I've had a look at the participant list, many of the other people in the participant list were people actively engaged in that space and gave very generously of their time under pressure. So on the 2nd of January, our department established an internal task force to coordinate the bushfire response that was occurring across many branches in the department. And this group met pretty much every day, first thing in the morning for the next few months. By the 15th of January, less than 2 weeks later, the first 50 million of emergency funding had been announced by the Australian government, and the Wildlife and Threatened Species Bushfire Recovery Expert Panel that Libby and Callie mentioned earlier was announced and had met for the first time. So this panel was chaired by the Threatened Species Commissioner, Sally Box, and it included 8 eminent scientists from across relevant different disciplines. And this included members of the Threatened Species Scientific Committee and the National Environmental Science Program, the TSR Hub, and Libby, who's also on the line. And it also included senior advisors from the states and territories. And I imagine some of them are on the line as well. And Anne Buchan is certainly on the panel today. So this panel was designed to be a hub for coordinated action across jurisdictions and other stakeholders, and was tasked with prioritising the species and the ecological communities for recovery. So by the 11th of February, the panel had published the first list of high priority native species in urgent need of management intervention. So pretty swift work. The panel itself convened almost weekly and met more than 20 times between January and September 2020. So pretty hefty workload during that period. At the same time, early on, so during January and February of that year, the Environment Minister hosted a series of emergency roundtables, which brought together more than 200 cross-sectoral stakeholders to discuss the immediate bushfire recovery actions. And again, I expect some of the people who participated and contributed to those workshops are here today as well. And while all of this was happening, our Geospatial and Information Analytics branch in the department, working with the expert panel and with several other experts, developed decision-making support tools that were critical in informing wildlife recovery. So these included fire severity mapping capability. So using national data sets on fire extent, our colleagues took this a step further and developed the capability to categorise and map the severity of the bushfires at a 40-metre grid scale And this was really only possible because of the collegiate sharing of resources and data between the Commonwealth and states. They also developed a decision analysis support tool, which is this colourful Excel spreadsheet here, which is fondly known by many of us as the BREDS tool. And it helped us to determine impacts and the value of an activity on a particular species or in a particular geographic area. So if we take the East Gippsland region shown here, you can see visually the extent of the fire and also areas that experienced really high fire severity. Using the BREDS tool, we can quickly quantify this to understand that over 40% of the region was burnt, 51% of that at a pretty high severity, and that almost 120 species were prioritised in this region for recovery. Then we can drill down further to individual species. So the one I've got up here is the East Gippsland galaxus, and understand that 100% of its range occurred in that region, 88% of its range was burnt, and 95% of this was burnt at a high severity. So in other words, for that species in that region, the impact was enormous. We can then go one step further with that BREDS tool to understand the key management actions identified for this species by the expert panel. So in this case, one of them was protecting remaining unburnt sites. So the expert panel identified 810 priority species and ecological communities for urgent management intervention. And this data set is very much priorities at the national scale, and some of these priorities may differ at state or local scales. But in summary, the national scale priorities included 92 vertebrate animals, 213 invertebrates, 486 plants, and 19 threatened ecological communities. And I guess of particular concern with the size, frequency, and intensity of fires likely to increase with a changing climate. Many of the species that were identified were previously considered secure but were significantly impacted by the bushfires. So of the almost 800 impacted species identified by the expert panel, more than 600 were not previously listed as threatened under national environment law. And this included over half of the vertebrates and the majority of the invertebrates and the plants. Building off the initial assessments by the expert panel, many of these species are now being considered by the Threatened Species Scientific Committee for listing under national environment law under an accelerated process, which is being pursued at the moment. So I'll just switch now to talk in a little more detail about the Wildlife Recovery Program response. So as I mentioned, the Australian government made 50 million available in January of that year for emergency interventions and initial recovery actions. So a quarter of these funds were contracted in January, the same month they were announced, and 60% of these funds were contracted by March 2020. So any of you on the line who've worked designing and delivering programs in government will understand that this was no mean feat and was pretty critical for the immediate response efforts. At the same time as this, an additional $2 million was made available to the Threatened Species Recovery Fund under the National Environmental Science Program for post-fire research to understand impacts and guide recovery. And then a further 150 million was announced a couple of months later, which focused on the longer term recovery actions and building resilience of impacted species. So state agencies and natural resource management regions, so those with strong capacity to be able to spring quickly, were pretty front and centre in delivering much of this investment. But considerable funding has also been provided to universities, to zoos, community groups, Indigenous organisations, and to many other NGOs. And many of the projects supported under the 50 million emergency fund are now finishing up. And the findings of those early investments are flowing. And importantly, these include some really positive responses and some pleasant surprises, which are just important for us to keep sight of under such sort of difficult circumstances. So for the longer term recovery and resilience investment in the 7 bushfire regions identified as most affected and shown here in this slide, a co-design process was used to identify and direct the recovery efforts. So regional profiles were developed for each region, built from national and regional quantitative data generated by that BREDS tool. And these were truth checked and adapted by state agencies and NRM regions. And this way of corralling information was generally well received in reviews of the program and seen as an effective way to do sort of day one of a workshop. So this information was then used to inform co-design workshops, which were facilitated by Libby and colleagues of hers, where a wide range of participants were led through the decision-making process to identify the types of activities that were required in each area and the percent of funding that should be dedicated to that activity as a form of prioritisation. So pretty similar themes came out in most regions: feral predator and feral herbivore control, weed management, erosion control, fire management, and generally several species-specific interventions. Traditional owner-led reading and healing of country was also a prominent theme and a solid investment across most of those regions, and that's been complemented by a specific Indigenous fire and land management knowledge exchange program under that second phase of bushfire recovery funding. So at this point in time, nearly 2/3 of the 800 plus species and ecological communities identified by the expert panel are intended to benefit from the recovery support being delivered under these programs. But of course, some of the taxonomic groups are better understood and served through this process than others, and groups such as invertebrates certainly have large knowledge gaps, and their recovery needs will have been definitely less well addressed through this process. So final slide for me. The Bushfire Royal Commission report states that when it comes to natural disasters such as the bushfires, what was previously unprecedented is now our future. So reflecting on our learnings to date from those Black Summer bushfires, as well as being prepared for future events, is pretty critical for our threatened species recovery to the future. So in short, cooperation, the collective wildlife recovery response was marked by significant cooperation between governments, scientists, traditional owners, land managers, NGOs and others, and elements of that are continuing, and we're seeing that today, including between federal and state agencies through some of our ongoing governance arrangements, which were forged through those times. Knowledge and data, there's a lot more to do, but we are improving our knowledge and data for both species and ecological communities, along with the systems for capturing and exchanging data and developing national standards to inform this. Many aspects of of getting resources and funding flowing quickly and where they were most needed, we felt worked quite well. But the Royal Commission made some recommendations for streamlining funding delivery arrangements, including to support rapid assistance for environmental assets. And finally, I guess the groundbreaking work of the expert panel, which you've heard quite a bit about today, is being brought together into a legacy document, and key aspects of this will be used to help guide future emergency responses to major national disasters. That's it from me. Thank you.
Thanks, Fiona. That's great. And I think we'll come back to many of those points and questions in our discussion shortly. Just before we move to general Q&A, I'm going to introduce our other two panelists for our discussion. So first up, in our panel, we have Luke Farago. Luke is a manager of land services at Northern Tablelands Local Land Services, and who experienced both the emergency and the response and recovery phases of the 2019-20 bushfires in his region. So I'm going to throw to you, Luke. Fiona's just outlined the importance of NRM agencies and state governments in the recovery response, but can you tell us a little bit about what your experiences were in the 2019-20 fires and the role of local land services, and also what you think will be needed to better protect biodiversity and cultural heritage from bushfires into the future?
Thanks, Rachel, and look, thanks for the opportunity. And it's quite a daunting prospect actually presenting after that range of presenters before me. But what I'd like, the key point before I get into my presentation is all the pieces are there, and all the things that I'm about to talk about, we have the tools. It's really about planning and coordinating, which is the key to being more effective in the lead up to these fires. So I'll just share my screen and give you a short presentation. What I'm going to talk about is essentially what's LLS or Local Land Services role. Local Land Services is a key NRM delivery body in. So what I'm going to do is run through Local Land Services role in emergencies once I've done a really quick flick through for you and work backwards. All right. So LLS has a formal role in this, but we also have a key role in preparation and building resilience in landscapes and communities with a particular focus on production. So I won't be talking a lot about conservation reserves and how national parks fought the fires with a rural fire service and stuff like that. I'm going to talk about LLS's experience in the 1925s, and then what I'm going to do is try and stimulate the discussion a bit and pose a couple of discussion questions to go from there. So LLS's role is primarily an animal welfare and assessment response during fires. So we're a response agency that actually works with the Rural Fire Service, parks and councils in the incident management centres. So while we're not necessarily fighting the fires like this and doing all the hard work that the RFS and parkies are doing at the time, we're not far behind them. So as soon as the fireground's safe, LLS is in there undertaking domestic stock assessment. So it's an animal welfare function. We send in vets, we send in biosecurity officers. Essentially, we do rapid assessment of animal welfare on behalf of landholders and determine whether to destroy or feed the stock. So clearly it's an important role that's a very difficult thing for landholders to do when they're already in the thick of an emergency. The other role we have is we establish evacuation centres. So not only are we going onto the fireground, but we're establishing evacuation centres for the community. And we're also attending and participating in information events for the community. So we've got a pretty close connection to the impact of the fires when they occur. And then we've got a formal role of delivering significant amounts of fodder and water to basically keep domestic stock alive. Because you've got to remember, going into these fires, we had significant drought. Conditions. Local Land Services was already in a full-blown emergency response for drought, and then we shifted that into fire. So the conditions were unprecedented. So the other role we play that I think is part of this conversation is sort of, we are key delivery agents for natural resource management interventions, whether it be educational or direct investment from our partners in the Australian government or other state initiatives. And we also work closely with Aboriginal communities in our region as well. And I'll circle back to that one in a sec. In fact, it's good to see Ollie on the screen again. It's been too long working with Ollie in our region. So, but essentially what we're doing is trying to build landscape resilience for extension and protecting remnant vegetation, undertaking revegetation activities, riparian protection, and specific threatened species threat mitigation. Some of the other opportunities that I think are worth mentioning for LLS is we do whole farm planning with landholders, and we're looking to roll that out as a consistent approach across the state. And I think that actually has a key role in preparing communities and biodiversity assets for protection. As I said, a lot of threatened species threat mitigation and rewilding. So for instance, at the moment, we're reintroducing Bell's turtle back into key habitat in our region at the moment. And we've got a number of research partnerships with universities. As I said, we have close working relationships with our Aboriginal communities. We have Aboriginal staff, but we also have an Aboriginal reference advisory group, which has connections to all the local Aboriginal land councils in the region. And as far as a response goes, as you can see from Fiona's presentation, we can marshal significant resources in post-fire. But what I'll do is I'll shift back to what I think and trying to spur the discussion on what I think we can do to enhance preparation and resilience of landscapes and communities in the lead up to fire as well. So LLS has delivered 2 key recovery programs, some of which was funded by what was Fiona was talking about. One was a $200 million Supporting Our Neighbours program, which is basically reserve system production interfaces in the landscape, and also an $18 million bushfire stimulus program, which was part of that $50 million that Fiona was talking about as well. So as a result of that, in the context of what we're talking about today, we undertook, that enabled us to do additional work of 2,500 hectares of threatened species habitat enhancement, rehabilitation or further protection, more than 60 kilometres of rivers and estuaries enhanced and rehabilitated. And probably one of the key role LLS plays in its other core delivery functions is vertical pest and weed control. So as part of that funding, we're able to extend additional vertical pest control to 1.5 million hectares of surrounding country, and also 125,000 hectares of targeted weed control. And that can include things like tropical soda apple in the Macleay, running through those reserve systems in that eastern fall country. So what was LLS's experience in this? Well, you've seen from Fiona's maps earlier, the eastern seaboard, particularly the reserve system on eastern fall country of the Great Dividing Range, was significantly impacted. And the key driver here was, prolonged 6 to 7 years of drought and some record temperatures and climatic circumstances in the lead up. It really was an unprecedented major impact on reserve estates across New South Wales in particular, but also all the surrounding production land as well. So I'll sort of circle back to a bit of a production emphasis at the moment, in a moment, but you can see from the graphs there that, Greater Sydney metro area and all the World Heritage areas and various reserves in that area were significantly impacted. But as you can see up around the North Coast, Northern Tablelands, particularly down in the southeast areas, there were significant areas of country that doesn't traditionally burn as well. So during the 1920 fires, over that sort of anywhere from September onwards, basically, but the really intense periods were that December, January periods. I was working in the Incident Management Centre in Glen Innes, working closely with the Rural Fire Service and councils, national parks and so on. So it gave me an insight into what an incredible machine the response and fighting fires is. But just, it really opened my eyes as to, you can't start talking biodiversity at that stage. A plan's got to be implemented and agreed to by the response agencies before you go into a fire. Once they're into that fire protection mode, then, there's a formula, there's a system, there are very sort of well-resourced and coordinated actions being taken by parks and Rural Fire Service in particular. But essentially the key takeaway that I learned is they don't put out fires, and they certainly don't put out fires in this last one. What they do is let fires burn and undertake asset management protection. So how do we get biodiversity as part of that asset management protection? There have been baby steps in this space in the past, but I'll just sort of come over to the next slide. And so what I wanted to do was ask some discussion questions to try and stimulate some discussion. But what I've got up here on the screen is an example of a fire calendar that we developed with the Aboriginal communities in our region. So we went to our elders and our lauks and said, look, what do you need? Not from a fire perspective, from an LLS support perspective. And they said, we want to get kids back on the country. And, well, how do we do that? Well, we want to introduce that flow of knowledge through young Aboriginal people and bring them back onto country. And there's plenty of opportunities in the Northern Tablelands. But one of the key pieces of knowledge that was lost from these elders was traditional burning. So we were able to understand where some of those barriers were, provide the resources and support to facilitate that journey of these Aboriginal communities in our region towards getting the knowledge back, understanding how to apply it best, because that knowledge had to come back down from Arnhem Land originally, like we'd properly lost it in the region. And then we're able to, with research support and the support of people like Oliver and RFS and Fire Sticks and stuff like that, develop these fire calendars, which are essentially seasonal guides to undertaking traditional burning in the region. And that can vary quite a lot across the region. But it's one of the proudest things I've been involved in since working for government. But it reinforces that point that I was making earlier, which is really put yourself in the shoes of the combat agencies at the time. How are they making decisions? What's in front of them to make those decisions, and how do they prioritise those? So it's all well and good listing all threatened species and threatened ecological communities in the lead up and so on. But in a triage environment of limited resources and tough decision making, how do you get some of our key biodiversity assets treated the same as a mobile phone tower or a small community town or some other asset that's being protected? So are we having the right conversations with the combat agencies on how they're making decisions, what information they need to make those decisions, and providing clear information to it? So that's why it's so exciting to see the work that Fiona was presenting, because it provides lessons learned and coordination of a response. But can we create a similar scenario, as Libby and Kelly were indicating, to inform that process and do it in a realistic way. And I'll talk about the SMARTER principles, the specific, measurable, achievable, and realistic. So what's realistic in these situations? What existing mechanisms? So for instance, in New South Wales, we have areas of outstanding biodiversity identification pathways under biodiversity legislation. EPBC Act has similar things, including important wetlands, things like that. How do we build those into the combat and response agencies? When, it's pretty intense when they're fighting these fires. So how do you get all the prep? It's not the time to start the conversation and then start triaging biodiversity assets. You need to understand what you want them to protect before the fire starts. So, and coming back to what Ollie was saying is, how do we get fire back into the production landscape? And I've deliberately used the word production there. Conservation, fire management is actually really well researched, studied and planned from what I can see with National Parks and Wildlife Service in New South Wales. Yes, there's some work we can do across the nil tenure combined agency responses, but significant areas of threatened species habitat and threatened species themselves are on privately owned land that are being used for production and agricultural activities. How do we work with those producers to get them on board in this? How do we get traditional knowledge that's now being re-established within our Aboriginal communities to become best practice grazing management again? How do we get those mosaic burns back into grazing pastures? And they're the little steps we're trying to take at the moment. And, first introduce the knowledge, understand how to use it properly. And now we're doing the ecological surveys to quantify the science behind it so we can pitch it as a best practice agricultural activity and really mainstream traditional knowledge and remove that hard separation. But to do that, it's got to be a whole landscape approach. How do you do that as a landscape approach? Ollie was talking earlier about sort of cultural boundaries. How do you incorporate that sort of understanding and knowledge into that? And what are the legislative barriers? So, for instance, I've got a bit of background in policy in this space, and traditional burning is treated as a traditional Aboriginal activity under New South Wales native vegetation laws. But as soon as that becomes a commercial enterprise, then burning becomes an authorised activity that needs some legislative consideration. So how are we removing these simple barriers out of the way to facilitate these next steps in integrating traditional knowledge into best practice landscape management as well? So I guess I'll shut up now. I'll probably talk for more than I was, but here's a couple of photos from up around our area. And I guess this is what we're trying to avoid. These really hot wildfires at the end of a drought where everything just goes up and there's nothing left. There are some areas that I still ride my bike through, which are like moonscapes in our region, because it was so hot, it just killed everything, including seed banks. And how do we get our landscapes to more something like this, where we've got fire in the landscape, but we've got the resilience of the landscape to bounce back from these things and provide those opportunities for threatened species and biodiversity to adapt to smaller areas burning so they can move around and then re-establish in these sort of areas. So that's me from a short presentation perspective. Back to you, Rachel.
Thanks, Luke. That's terrific. And you're doing my job for me by posing all these questions, which we'll bring back to the panel in just a moment. So thanks so much for that. Last up, but certainly not least, I'd like to bring in our final panellist, Anne Buchan. So Anne is Manager of Biodiversity Knowledge at the Victorian Government's Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning. The Victorian Government has been doing a lot of work, both around preparedness and biodiversity in the emergency management context, but also building resilience in the landscape in the light of future fires. So as Fiona said earlier, what was unprecedented is now our future. So I might kind of just reflect on that as I kind of come back to you and bring you into the conversation. And what is happening in your space in Victoria around building resilience, and how are we working to spread this risk of the fires to kind of build up, landscape assets and, backups, but also to protect cultural heritage, to protect biodiversity and recover those things in the aftermath of these kinds of events.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. I think it's really, these bushfires have really brought to light the need and the importance of doing this. And I think, a lot of different organisations and states in the Commonwealth have been thinking about some of these aspects, and that we should be thinking about, genetic rescue for species, thinking about getting our data organised. And this was a real spur in the heat of the moment that we had to do something. For us in Victoria, it was the first time that we appointed a level 2 state controller for wildlife, and that made a significant difference in how we respond to the bushfires in the middle of the event. We had natural values and wildlife officer roles that helped to try and integrate that our key biodiversity information into the incident management teams. And I think that became really important during the fire. The things that we need to do to prepare in future, like making sure we've got staff trained in those roles, making sure partners are trained or understand the use of the tools and information. So there's been some really important kind of grounding information or grounding actions that we need to do, and we need to continue to build on in future. In terms of, moving forward, we really acknowledge we need to be proactive. We need to undertake strategic management to start thinking about that, whether that's focused, all of this needs to be a particular focus on working together with our First Nations peoples or partners in the area. Partly, again, this is what we've been doing for a long time with the traditional owners, rebuilding knowledge, getting fire back out on country. We've been using some strategic tools, for example, the development of a cultural fire strategy in Victoria to help support those actions moving forward. But also thinking about how do we strengthen country or restore species back out on country, get those species that perform really strong functions on country or have particular significance for traditional owners that they need back out on country for their own well-being and for the health of country as well. And how do they get out on country immediately after the fire to be able to read country and heal country. That together in partnership with them, we need to think about the other aspects to increase resilience to fire. Spreading the risk between populations where we've only got one population, think about other populations or insurance populations. That might be at new locations, it might be improving the genetics to stop, or the fitness of the population to stop population failure. So Victoria's kind of been using a range of tools to do that, trying to work through which are the priority species, looking at new data and information around genetics or around important populations to help with that decision making. And I think that will kind of continue in the future as we expand to think about not just this bushfire zone, but other areas within those species range, but also other species across the state as well. It's going to be important to move forward.
Great, thank you, and thanks everyone for fantastic introductory comments and talks to get us into this topic. I might just start with a couple of questions that have come in for Libby and Kelly, particularly on, I think there's two different questions from a similar angle. One is about this question of, of habitat modelling and really needing to get better knowledge base to be able to really understand where things are in the landscape to do that planning. And then the second question I wanted to put to you was just a little bit of devil's advocate about, the responses that you got from different agencies. How honest, how frank do you think people were able to be in your research? And do you think you got to the bottom of the problem with the people that you spoke with? Was it mainly government? Were there other people involved? And do you think that you got to the heart of some of these core questions about what needs to be done?
Thanks, Rachel.
Yeah,
Libby, do you want to take the first one and I'll take the second?
Sounds good. So I think for the habitat modelling, and that was a great question by David, and I just responded. So that was, that was me just rushing through it. Talk, David. Absolutely, I think having, as Rachel says, the data to understand where things are in the landscape, and and having habitat models, because as you say, there's lots of flaws in the data that need to be accounted for. So that was recognised as a real gap by many of the participants, and of course that varies across the different state agencies as to how how up to date those habitat models are as well. So I agree with you. Yeah, that was considered a real gap for many threatened species and communities. I'll throw to Kel for the.
Thanks, Libby. In relation to the end part of your question, certainly our research process meant that all contributions in interviews were anonymous, and any reference to contributions were de-identified in the reporting process. And I was quite heartened by how frank and upfront most of the contributions people were able to be in the interview process. I certainly acknowledge that there were other groups that it would have been great to include, obviously, other stakeholders, NGOs, private protected areas, traditional owners, all would have had valuable contributions, but the project did have to be bound, of course, to allow it to fit into the timeline, and 32 interviews, hour-long interviews, was already quite a lot. So that was where the project decided to bound it.
Yeah, great. I might just go to Ollie now. So Ollie, a couple of questions both from Luke's talk and really kind of reflecting on what some people are putting into the Q&A as well. You know, one of the things Luke put forward is the question of how we get good fire back into production landscapes to manage those. But I think there's also a little bit of, I guess, a question in my mind from what Luke said about, you know, parks and conservation reserves being relatively well managed, and just I'd like to invite you to speak a bit more about the barriers that might still exist about, particularly about First Nations involvement in fire management across, you know, across different tenures.
Sure. Thanks, Rachel. And it's a great question. I picked up on a couple of points in the presentation, but I think the main kind of issue is really around, particularly in the sort of southeast, where we have fairly large areas of public and private land holdings that don't have adequate relationships in place to support traditional owner management. And so being able to kind of enhance the capacity and the capability and recognition, like it is true that, you know, there's a lot of loss of knowledge in a lot of Aboriginal communities in the areas that the fires were most significant. But it is also true to say that there is a lot of aspirations and capacity and knowledge in those communities as well to revive their cultural land management practices. So some of the key challenges really is, and it's been, you know, some work done through particularly the Commonwealth Ranger program and IPA programs and stuff. But when you look at those projects across, say, New South Wales, you know, it's a very small proportion of the landscape that's actually being resourced to be managed. So increasing that investment is really critical. Local land services have played a part in many areas as well by supporting cultural land management projects. And National Parks also has a fairly comprehensive joint management program, but they all still fall short of what is required when it comes to, you know, so many Aboriginal communities not having the adequate resources. And I showed that slide of Jabulum, for example, and I've got more slides on that. Like, local land services funded Jugwin Alliance to develop a program with Jabulum. It was really just, you know, we ran some workshops and we did some planning. We developed a seasonal calendar. We developed a bushfire sort of cultural management plan. We identified, but there's no resources to actually implement the work. And so, you know, within a year, a fire had come through and taken out most of that around that community. So it goes to show, if we had that, if there was a ranger team in place and the adequate training and resourcing, we could have actually gone out and implemented that burning. We identified it, we had knowledge holders, we demonstrated it. But yeah, issues that Luke raised as well around tenure, you know, around insurance, around the issues around, you know, being able to implement those activities. Yeah, if you're on private land, you know, if you do it as a cultural activity, you can get through the red tape. But as soon as it's a commercial activity, you're studying all these roadblocks, and it's like, how are we going to manage these landscapes if we don't remove these roadblocks? And so that's the critical thing: funding, reducing regulation, and looking to the knowledge holders to step up in the landscape and provide that leadership.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Ollie. And I guess that's a really good opportunity for me to go back to Fiona and Anne and Luke in particular to think about, you know, that challenge that raises, that Ollie was raising. They're both about the, you know, those barriers, the legislative, the policy barriers, you know, the tenure barriers, but also the funding barriers. So perhaps Fiona first, if I might turn to you and see if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, thanks, Ollie, and interesting questions. I guess I see these as sort of barriers that get chipped away at over time, and part of the context for this as well is one of the or a couple of the recommendations out of the the Bushfire Royal Commission did go to Indigenous fire and land management, and that certainly food for thought. We'd already, I guess, identified a couple of programs to spur that on already, and because that was obviously going to be an outcome. But that's also happened at the state level as well. So I guess New South Wales have started up a cultural, I've forgotten what it's called actually, but maybe a New South Wales colleague can remind me, but it's like a cultural fire.
Yeah.
That's it. Yeah, thank you. And we certainly worked with them when we were rolling out 150 million in building the capacity in that space. I guess one thing we really noticed so for us with the 50 million and then the 150 million, and we think of those packages quite differently, is we didn't engage really fulsomely with Indigenous communities for the 50 million because there was such a focus on emergency response, being able to hit the ground running, working with organisations that had strong capacity already. And so I guess there's some lessons learned for us in being able to do that better from the start next time. But we certainly attempted to pick that up through the phase 2 or the 150 million with a really active participation of Indigenous communities in those co-design workshops, and a real eagerness to play a central role in delivery of those that funding. Again, it was this interesting situation of being able to work with groups that had the capacity to do that. Even though we're calling it the longer term resilience piece, it still only went for a couple of years. And so that's not enough time to start a new ranger team and get it underway if there's not ongoing funding. So it's finding sort of opportunities, I think, that are fit for purpose. And certainly our observation through that co-design process was that there were already some really good partnerships in place that could seed some of that capacity building. And that co-design process also brought together different stakeholders in a collaborative way, but sometimes in a forced way that ended up in a collaborative arrangement. And I think that worked quite well for both parties at times. I'd be interested to understand your reflections on that. So we rolled out lots of money for actively, Indigenous-led sort of recovery activities, but we also had that $2 million for the workshops, and which goes to the heart of some of the work you're talking about, Ollie, and I know you've been involved in that. So I'd be interested in your and that was really oversubscribed, popularly taken up, interested in your reflections on what role that might play into the future as well, which is that two-way toolbox knowledge exchange, but building capacity as well.
Yeah, thanks, Fiona. Yeah, I think really important investment, the 2 million for the workshops, a great initiative. And I guess it comes back to that long term, like short period window, COVID, there's we need a longer term approach. And I was involved in some of the co-design workshops and stuff, and great discussions. But being kind of like one step removed, I don't really see what's going on. And a lot of the community partners, Aboriginal partners, then they don't seem to be engaged. So it's kind of like that, I think the intent of the Commonwealth Department around shifting some focus to traditional owners has been really promising, and we're really grateful. But I guess there's a lot of in-between development that needs to occur so that we can identify where the capacity is in communities and target support for the capacity and understand where different knowledge holders and range of programs are and what is the development pathway there, because there's some that are super capable and are out there doing amazing work. And that could be really expanded through really targeted support and mentoring and development. And there's a whole, so many groups out there. If you look at some of the funding application processes and some of the, when I first started doing this work in New South Wales, when I first founded the first fire sticks projects, if you look at the research and the media, it was almost non-existent. I know that there was knowledge and there were groups doing stuff on the ground, but you just weren't seeing it. So there's always that iceberg effect. And so now we're seeing all these groups really stepping up and wanting to be involved, but it takes time. If you look at some of the most, successful sort of programs in some of the government departments, and, you see how they've been able to kind of meet their targets and get fire programs underway, there's hundreds and hundreds of years of experience within those teams of people that are coming together, after 10, 20-year careers that, know the landscape, got networks, communication, connections, and that sort of stuff. And in this Indigenous land management space, you've got this whole body of knowledge. But when it comes to building those teams, a lot of people don't have that long-term experience within the government frameworks. And so they've got knowledge how to burn, but they don't have the relationships with the key government stakeholders or agency people to actually achieve that. And so that's where we've got to do a much better job at actually making those linkages improving that investment and coordination, identifying that capacity and investing in what works.
Right. So I might go to you now, Anne. You know, your experience in Victoria is, you know, every state has its own policies, its own agencies, its own rules. So can you give us a couple of thoughts about where you think we're at in that process in Victoria?
Look, I think it's you're right. It's kind of variable between states, and obviously Victoria's been specifically around getting, you know, cultural fire has been a priority in Victoria for a number of years, and so there's obviously we've got our cultural fire strategy, which is developed in partnership with the traditional owners in Victoria. There's integration of cultural fires into the kind of fire management planning, so that future kind of planned burning. We still need to use all of the standard kind of government processes, but it is flexible in allowing that, you know, ensuring that cultural burns are going onto that register and they're planned for. There's opportunities for training for Aboriginal people so that they've got the right tickets or the right qualifications to be able to go out and do fire in accordance with the government regulations. So we're still working within the government framework, unfortunately, but you know, we're doing everything that we can to progress that. So we're kind of seeing gradually more and more groups undertaking cultural fire. It might be starting small and growing. There's, you know, the groups that are in the bushfire space now are starting to think about how can they get fire back out on country? How can they use it even in some of these kind of burnt areas, in terms of perhaps that's to maybe to help for a particular purpose, so to control weeds, for example. So those, you know, it's still on people's mind. How do they do it? How do they get access to it? Sometimes insurance, you know, if they're kind of wanting to undertake fires on private land or other areas, those kind of things are coming up of how do they manage that to ensure that they can continue to burn. But I think it also plays out, they're also using fire in conjunction with other actions. So it was really important, you know, immediately in the bushfire space, when we're kind of thinking about, oh crap, the fires are extensive, we need to do something, what do we do? It was also, we need to support traditional owners to be involved, to undertake the works that they need to do to heal country or to read and understand the bushfires. So that kind of working together in the immediacy has been really important, and the flexibility in funding. So if we're providing funding, thinking about different ways of giving that funding. In this bushfire space, we after talking with the traditional owners, they actually asked for foundational funding to start with, an equal amount of funding that will help each group, whether it's a full kind of recognised corporation or whether it's a small group that's just bringing their community together. They wanted that bit of funding to help them organise, to help them think, to help them plan for what they want to do. And then based on capacity, that they might ask for more funding to be able to deliver some activities. And that, you know, thinking through how we actually deliver funding has been really important to actually enabling some of these groups to get out on country. For some of them, it was the first time the community had been out together on country that had access to the land. So those things have been really important.
Thanks, Anne. And Luke, I'm not sure if you've come off mute or if you stayed off mute, but I might actually go back to you and turn your question back to you about what's been your experience about for First Nations people to be able to get access to putting fire into production landscapes, and where do you think we're at with that?
Well, I think Ollie hit it on the head initially, which is there's lots of people with good plans out there, but do they have consistent, reliable, long-term resources to implement those plans? And then tell the story and pass on the benefits of it. So I guess coming back to your bigger picture question is we're getting pretty good, from what I can see in the response phase, of multi-agencies, nil tenure responses, but I'd like to see that same coordination ability in the planning, preparation, preparing, particularly from a protecting biodiversity end. So that same effort and the same lessons learned that we put into the back end, we need to put into the front end. And I'll quote Al Gore here from a very ancient climate change reference, that there's no silver bullet. You know, it's silver buckshot, and every pellet needs to be hitting the target. So while Indigenous traditional knowledge and Indigenous land management plays an important part in that, it's not the solution for everything. It's a critical piece in evolving how we're managing the land. But what do we, you know, I guess I'm actually going to read from a note that I've written here in the lead up to this conversation is, we've got, and it comes back to that Al Gore quote, we've got a lot of disparate pieces operating, but what we need is a well-resourced leader in this space to deliver a landscape approach to integrating fire into natural resource management. So it's not just a response, but it's how we're managing the landscape in the lead up to these responses, how we're minimising the impact on threatened species, how we're creating a mosaic of fire back across the landscape again. And I challenge those that are on this webinar to, probably the next big opportunity for a lot of people on this webinar is regional land care program. The second round of regional land care program, which is not too far around, and a lot of agencies and everyone are starting to prepare and their pitch for that. But and what we're finding working with the Australian government is there's a hunger for co-designing these things. So let's start those conversations now, not when we're looking to distribute funds. And it may not be, the regional land care program. It may be a range of other funding sources. But what's missing is, and it comes to some of the questions that we can see in the Q&A here, who's got the authority to do this in a response? There are some very powerful legal measures already in place for having clear leadership during a response, but are we seeing the same thing at the front end of the thought process? So in many respects, we're chasing a tail at the moment, and we need to get in front of the cart, if I can mix my metaphors.
Thanks, Luke. And I actually think that's a really important question that you flagged there about who has the authority in the emergency. I might actually come back to that question of whether we do have the settings right around that, including in particular, having traditional owners be able to have a say over the movement of species, for example, in an emergency. So we'll come back to that. But I actually think, and I'm sorry, Fiona, but it's also come out from our Q&A. So I am gonna put it to you about this question about coordination of a whole bunch of different programs. And of course, that's a question for state government and other agencies as well. But from an Australian government perspective, there is a lot of investment in different kinds of programs around threatened species, around threat management, around Indigenous ranger programs and other things. But is there a case for a more coordinated approach? For example, for a National Land Management Agency, I'm just quoting for Rod's question here, and thank you, Rod. And that kind of or other ways of coordinating at the national level to work in partnership with states and with traditional owners and other groups, and invest in this kind of preparedness and the resilience of our landscapes in a longer term way.
Not sure where to start with that. There's always scope for more coordination and more joined upness. And I guess that response to the bushfire was a really good example of where we did do that under pressure and with a lot of goodwill. How often we can repeat that under pressure and all of that goodwill, if we face lots of natural disasters into the future, might be another question. So what I think the response to these bushfires showed was that we can do that. And sometimes some barriers that have been there for a long time, including with partners, that we should be more close, work more closely within states, across states, and between the Commonwealth and states and different sorts of organisations. Those barriers were broken down, and I think that's sort of done a bit of a reset or change the playing field in some ways, which I think is really good and bodes really well for the future. I don't think anyone, well, I take that back. I think most people who are actively involved in this response would have come out of it with a pretty positive feeling around the coordination that can lead to really, really sort of good recovery. The setting up of a new agency, I'm not sure about that. That certainly hasn't been a recommendation that we've been sort of tasked with, or to my knowledge has come out of the Royal Commission or anything along those lines. And certainly within the Australian government, we do, of course, give a lot of thought as to how our different programs will complement each other. I don't think the person who's posed the question, and sorry, I can't see them, means this, but I don't think one big central program is the answer to this. I think we have different programs with different purposes, and as long as they're complementary and not sort of competing with each other, I think that works quite well. We do have different sort of aspirations at different scales as well. So the Commonwealth priorities are going to differ to state and regional and local priorities quite often, and that's natural and to be accepted, and needs to be built into those equations. I think there's nothing wrong with that, with those different priorities at different scales, as long as there's opportunities for communication. I guess one of the things we've been pretty interested in and focused on as we're starting to get to the sort of tail end of some of those investments, both some of the research work that the hub has led on, Rachel, but also some of the on-ground investments under the 50 million, is how to effectively share that information. First of all, in our department, doing that really well. And so some of the things we're grappling with at the moment is how to get that information quickly to people who are considering assessments for threatened species, or species which were threatened through the bushfire impact, and then how to share that more broadly so that people can uptake that quickly and in a way that makes sense. We sometimes look at the Victorian government's lovely interactive bushfire website, which lends itself really well to doing things like that really effectively. But yeah, so that's some of the information we're grappling with at the moment. Doing that in a sort of consistent way, but also having a bit of a comms offensive at the moment as well. Now that we're getting a lot of information starting to flow, sharing that on social media, sharing that through media announcements, so the profile of some of the outcomes of this collaborative effort can be realised. I think I've strayed from the question a bit, Rachel, because it was such a broad question that doesn't really have a yes or no answer, but I've just used it as an opportunity to get on my soapbox about other things. So.
Well, actually, that was another question. I know you can't see the Q&A, but as it happens, we did have a question about whether the lessons learnt from phase 1 and phase 2 will be shared and where. So I think it sounds from what you just said that that's still a work in progress. Like it will be shared in, I guess, ephemeral ways through social media and media, but will there be repositories and how will people get access to those, or what's the thinking around that? So if you just want to quickly come back to that now, that might be.
Yeah, so as I said, we're sort of working on that now, and I guess it depends on the type of the data as well. And so at the same time as that is happening, we're sort of undergoing data reform work, which was commenced ahead of the bushfires, but certainly something that we're building on, so that we've got better systems for understanding the distribution and occurrence of our species and monitoring of that over time. So it's a matter of feeding some of that information where it's relevant, some of the survey results, etc., into those new data systems that we're creating, that have also been born out of the review of the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act as well. So there's a lot of different pieces that come together, which is a slow chipping away piece of work as opposed to a rapid thing that we're doing just in response to the bushfires. But certainly there's lots of different catalysts for this. And we also have our own system that we've got, the monitoring evaluation improvement tool that is, I guess, a central database for much of the program work that we support in the department for collating and sort of pooling up at a program level a lot of the information that we get from those projects. So. And I guess the other thing we did through this process that we don't ordinarily do with some of our programs is share very quickly with some of the other players in this space, some of the state agencies and the NRM regions, the projects we were funding, so that there could be as much complementary work being undertaken as opposed to doubling up. And so I guess we're all often just focused on getting work done in our own patch, so to speak, but there was much more sort of sharing in an attempt to make sure gaps were filled when it came to the recovery response, and we were avoiding double up as much as possible. It's a huge and complex space, and there was a lot of activities and people and money sort of flowing at the same time, so it's hard to do that perfectly, but I think there were big efforts on all sides to do that much more comprehensively than we normally would.
Rachel, I can shed a bit of light that from a delivery partner perspective. So I'm holding in my hot hands a draft evaluation report of the bushfire investment, which is, what achievements did we get and what were some of the key learnings. That will inform LLS and help inform the New South Wales government, but we'll also feed that back through to the Australian government via the merit reporting system that Fiona mentioned. And I suppose one piece of feedback, Fiona, for you and your colleagues online is there's a big demand to feed into the Canberra bubble, but it can be hard to extract the learnings from other delivery agents as well. So we're really hungry for that sort of learning.
I think that's really, really critical. And I just want to put in a plug for a couple of pieces of work that I also know about that is going to be doing some of this distillation work. So I think Libby is a co-editor on a book that is currently being pulled together from much of the research effort, but also many of the management agencies are, and government agencies are going to be putting in information into that book. And so keep your eye out for that book in 2022 2022, the lessons learned from the 2019-20 wildfires. The other thing is my own project with NRM Regions Australia is a knowledge project. And one of the things I really hope to do is to create open access knowledge bank information from all of the work of NRM regions, such as Luke's work. I'm really looking forward to seeing that report, Luke. But I think hopefully my project in NRM Regions Australia will also be one site where that repository of ready access information, particularly for land management and NRM agencies, will hopefully be to hand. But I think it is a really important point about not just feeding into government systems, but also how those things are becoming, you know, open access or accessible repositories of knowledge for anyone who needs to put their hands on that information at critical points in time. So I think that's a conversation for us ongoing. I might just switch gears now a little bit to one of the first questions that came through, because I think some of the answers that you gave, Fiona, really led us into this next question, which is, where is the balance for all of our energy, all of our resources, all of our knowledge building and sharing to be focused for species and ecological communities, and I'll add in cultural heritage and cultural species as well. Is it in, you know, what is the real need? So I think I'm going to start with Libby, Kelly and Oliver on this one actually. Where is the greatest gap or need? Is it in disaster preparedness? Is it in the emergency response? Is it in the recovery, or is it still in all three? And then I'm just going to warm you all up, the rest of you, to say, I'm going to come to you to say where you think the balance of our efforts needs to be in terms of coordinating what the lessons learned, but also where potential extra investment or extra effort in coordination needs to go. But perhaps I'll start with you, Libby, if you want to.
Yeah, and that was another great question. And you know, our project came about because you know the targeted action that occurred during the fire event was very ad hoc. There weren't many species and areas that were targeted for protection. So that's why we asked people, well, what happened and what do we need to do better? You can act, I think, Fiona, as Fiona outlined, and Anne as well, the decision making and the processes that we do after the event. There was a lot that happened in that space because there wasn't that much that happened during the event. But I still strongly believe, I think the ball is rolling now on how do we integrate conservation, cultural assets more into that during fire response. There's lots of information and planning and processes, you know, that need to be put in place for that to be effective. But I still think there's a huge risk in just leaving it to that point. You know, you can act then, but there's a high chance that you cannot act then, and you can act afterwards, but there's a good chance that it's too late. So I really strongly think that there needs to be more done prior to these events, and as Anne mentioned, you know, spreading risk prior to these events, such that, you know, we're sort of increasing the resilience of the landscape so that the impacts of these events aren't as great. And I know that's easy to say and it's difficult to do, but yeah, I do believe there's lots more that we can be doing for integrated sort of threat management prior to these events.
Yeah, Kelly, did you have any thoughts to add to that?
Thanks, Rachel. I think Libby has articulated it quite well, and I agree with her points there that to me a clear outcome from our research was the importance of the pre-fire preparation and planning stage, particularly with threatened species and communities, to ensure that we've got sufficient active management of these important conservation assets, and that they're managed in a way, as mentioned, to reduce the risks and need for intervention during the fire. So whether it's translocations or insurance populations or captive populations, these things to reduce the potential impacts of fire. So there'll always be the need for during fire and post-fire work, but with more effective pre-fire preparedness and planning, we can perhaps reduce that need.
Yeah, great. So Ollie, yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty simple, really. Like if the way I think about it, you know, when we go and do assessments for cultural burning, we go and identify the values, we talk about country, we talk about what's important, and then we think about how is it impacted by fire? What do we need to do to put the right fire in or prevent fire from happening here? And so, you know, I think in this context, it's the same thing. It's like, we need a resource, like there's all this money that's been spent. And as soon as there's an incident, there's blank checkbooks flying around everywhere. Like, it's a real thing. That's what happens. Incident, section 41, suddenly, you know, and everyone's turning up for the party because there's free lunch, you know, and then we've got this recovery money and that flows through. Basically, we're wasting all that money if we don't learn from that and we don't start investing in a long-term approach to build resilience, which is about being prepared, understanding the values. Like, there's so many really simple processes. Like, it's kind of frustrating. Like, you know, I started in this space, you know, 10 or 15 years ago. I didn't know much about fire in the landscape, and things I learned back then haven't been applied. Like, you know, national parks have got some great examples that I've learned from, you know, like they've developed cultural heritage maps that TOs had control over. So whenever there's an incident, first protocol, contact the knowledge holders, get them in the room, get them in the planning room. If you can't get them, then someone has a key to get the map, and we can use that map to make decisions. There's risk management plans to the wazoo everywhere that just don't have values in them. They just don't have really clear, simple, commonly held knowledge, because people aren't being resourced and supported to do that work. If you do that work and you've got good integration, modeling, mapping, you turn the maps on, you get the right people in the room, you make better decisions. People are just scratching around in the dark most of the time. And there's also a real issue around coordination and, you know, to be honest, conflict between different political and different issues within different groups. And there's lots of great examples where people are working together and the collaboration occurs, but there's also a lot of issues that where people get in a room and it's like, who's in charge and where do the decisions get made? That needs to be, I think, better worked through. And, you know, like, let's get people kind of harmonized before we create these kind of environments for making decisions where people that actually have really important knowledge to share either aren't asked, aren't being supported, or aren't being heard and listened to. And so how do we kind of get that planning right, I think, is the critical pathway, and realize the opportunities that we've come. Like, there's been, look at all the country that's been burnt. And there's been, you know, significant amount of money spent. But this is going to take 20, 30, 100 years to resolve, you know, and we're going to see more fires come and go over that time. So let's like get in and do the real work and actually have a long-term resilience plan and enable all these. There's so many people out there, like traditional owners, landholders, like people want to know how they can do things and how they can be supported. So let's share those resources, because one of the things I have seen, there's a lot of great work that's happened, a lot of great investment. I've seen a lot more jobs in government, you know, and that's good for government, but it's not so empowering for communities that want to be able to be better resourced to be able to be responsive to their needs. And so that's one of the things. It's easy to kind of shovel money into government, and that's what we've seen happen. But how do we build that long-term capability so when things happen, we can actually put those resources into really grassroots community, traditional owner and landholder networks, so that people on the ground get the resources and can go out and do the work instead of it filtering through all these layers, and we get a little bit of action on the ground at the end of the day. So I think that's that planning phase, that getting that prep, understanding values and understanding who's who and how we actually can support each other to look after country.
Yeah. Thanks, Ollie. And I think what you've just raised there is not just about whether it's preparedness or emergency or recovery, but what that preparedness looks like, and, you know, and who gets involved, who gets to be involved and to actually be part of that preparedness. So I'm still going to open up that broader question first to Anne, I think, about, you know, this balance across the spectrum of, I guess, the emergency and the tendency to, you know, in a crisis like we saw in 2019-20, you know, for this kind of galvanized response. But where that balance lies and how we build, you know, do we need to put more emphasis on building that resilience into, you know, into our landscapes in preparation for what is going to be another inevitable event, or hopefully, you know, to actually mitigate some of that if we prepare the landscapes well, and who needs to be at the table and how is that going to look?
Thanks, Rachel. I think it's useful to reflect on this bushfire was quite, in Victoria, it's quite different from, say, the 2009 bushfires. less impact on lives. And so that changed the kind of response to biodiversity, I think. So it kind of, obviously there'd been a lot of other discussion around environment and biodiversity in the intervening years, but because there was significantly less impact on lives, I think it opened up that opportunity to actually start to think about resources to help protect biodiversity in the midst of the fire. And I think it, on reflection, it means that we do have that opportunity to now start building a biodiversity response and consideration into the decision making in the immediacy of the emergency response. But it's also, I think we do need to come back to that. How do we build the resilience? And probably the example I'd give is galaxids. So there's a number of species. Often for many of the species, there's a single population. In both the recent fires and in the 2009 fires, and probably intervening, we've gone in the middle of the bushfires as soon as we could, gone and collected individuals from whatever sites we could, a number of different species, kind of bring them back, hold them for a few months and put them back. And it's kind of it's a no-win kind of response, right? We've saved them, but we've spent all that money on saving them and holding them temporarily, but we haven't really helped their long-term conservation. In our normal management of these species, probably the focus is on trout control to stop that immediate action. And we hadn't really started emphasising and thinking about the long-term response for these species if we've got more fires. And so really we need to, using that as an example, we really need to start thinking about, well, for each of the, there's a single population, we really need 3 populations. We need a population somewhere else so that if a bushfire went through that catchment, we've still got others in a different catchment or in an insurance population in captivity to ensure the survival of that species. And so I think that's a really important aspect that we need to be thinking about. I think it does need everyone at the table. Yes, there's traditional owners a key player. Some of these species are important to them, or all species are important, but they may also have a specific significance. But it's a species on their country that might be moving between country, and they have an interest, they have a role to play in that. There's different levels of expertise, and there's community interest as well, both in what happens to the species. So it's really important conversations to have. And often the ability to undertake, say, the bristlebird translocation in Victoria was actually because we'd been having those conversations prior to the bushfires. We've been planning to actually establish a new population somewhere else. So the conversations were being had, the preparation, the planning was kind of being had. And if we were doing that earlier, if we were doing that on a more regular basis, if we're actually doing those translocations and establishing the populations, that challenge where someone's got to make that decision, do I put the aircraft here or do I allow aircraft to go to this place to save that population, it lessens a bit.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Anne. And I guess I'll just, pick up on the other part of Terry Walsh's question here is, in terms of emergency translocations like the bristlebird, if you've got that planning, if you've got that preparedness in place, then perhaps you're not having to make it on the fly. But to what degree in the recent fires did First Nations perspectives get to be included in those on the fly decisions? Or was it really something that, had that already been built, or was it something that we need to learn for next time?
I think it's probably a mix of the two. In the bristlebird case, there'd been some discussions about the future translocation, but in the middle of the fires, in the regular kind of meetings, there were representatives from some of the larger traditional owner groups were in the discussions in a regular weekly catch up around whatever the planning meeting was for the incident at the time. The conversation started with traditional owners in January. About the response and about the bushfires and the actions that were kind of happening. So I think it varies between the situation, but more wholly in the fuller planning sense, but certainly throughout the process, including, ensuring that there were fire protection of scar trees and things like that. That's be putting protection around a tree. So, in those kind of decisions. And some of the traditional owner groups are now currently starting to work on their own biocultural emergency response frameworks of how they would like to see responses happen on fire for biocultural values. So I think it will continue to emerge and grow.
Yeah, great. Luke, you temporarily came off mute there. Did you have any thoughts on particularly about how, what was important to the traditional owner groups that you worked with, in terms of, for example, developing those climate and you know, seasonal calendars and what that means for fire preparedness, but also just learning those lessons about what is important in the landscape and you know, really having that voice at the table.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. Look, as far as response goes, my experience was there wasn't a traditional voice in the decision making around asset protection and triage. So in my mind, it's critical that the traditional owners are part of the conversation planning in the upfront, because and then are there to transfer the communication and the importance of those things and making sure that they're being integrated effectively in the system. So any change to a major response system or triage approach isn't just set a plan and hope it works. It's resourcing the right people in the right place to make sure it's happened, and also to bring the lessons learned from how we can improve that over time. And yeah, look, for me, traditional owners have a critical role in the landscape resilience and preparation role in this, but then that transfers through to protection of biodiversity and cultural assets and totems and key known Aboriginal cultural heritage sites and Indigenous protected areas. You know, our experience on the Tablelands was that most Aboriginal people were on ground fighting fires, you know, on Aboriginal owned land.
Yeah, thanks, Luke. So Fiona, I might just bring you back in there, and again, just sort of taking a step back from the question that you posed, or the challenge that you posed in your own talk about what was unprecedented is now our future. What does the future look like for the federal government? What is, I really think, you know, a few people have said it, but that coordinated response and that sense of all coming together around this challenge was really powerful in the aftermath of the Black Summer fires. But what does that look like into the future? And does the emphasis also shift to building more of that long-term resilience in our landscapes? And if so, how?
Yeah, sure. And thanks. And I just want to make sure that quote isn't attributed to me. It was actually the Bushfire Royal Commission, just in case. Yeah. It's a pretty good one. So I think, that's a massive question, and I'll only just get to the start of that, I think. So partly it involves maintaining the momentum around some of the work that we're doing at the moment and not losing sight of that. And really that work goes to all of the sort of critical components that the other panelists have just talked about. That is, and I find it really hard to pick one sort of arm of work over another. And I think Libby sort of put a good case for protecting refugia. So that's sort of being a gap, prevention better than cure. And I think that probably is a gap, but I think that needs to go hand in hand with that risk management, understanding where our assets are and being able to protect them. And Anne certainly used that example of the Galaxis, which I often use as a really great example of preventing an extinction because you knew where your asset was and what to do about it. And often we just don't have that information to bear. So I think it's chipping away at our understanding of where the species and ecological communities are, how vulnerable they are to fire and what those impacts are and the best response. It's continuing to undertake that landscape scale threat mitigation, whether that's keeping weeds at bay or combating other threats such as feral animals, etc. I don't think you can do one without the other. I think so it's maintaining those sort of systems of collaboration that we've set up, but also within the Commonwealth, it's continuing to advance some of that reform when it comes to monitoring data and information, and also new initiatives such as the Australian Climate Service, which have been born out of the Royal Commission and are bringing together a series of agencies to be able to better coordinate and respond in response to future natural disasters, not just bushfires, but across the board. So better, more comprehensive systems that go to the environmental assets, but certainly go to a lot of the other sort of infrastructure and assets as well. So I'll leave it there because I'm not sure. I could just rub it on forever. And I think there's other panelists who would maybe have some more informed opinions as well, but I'll leave it at that point at the moment. Oh, I would add one more thing with my Acting Threatened Species Commissioner hat on. We've got the new threatened species strategy out now, and many people will have been involved in the workshops and will be aware that one of the action areas under the new strategy is emergency preparedness and response, which was born out of our response to the bushfires, but certainly isn't restricted to that. And so it's definitely front and centre of how we consider sort of management of our threatened species going forward, is that sort of longer term resilience, but that sort of risk management for disasters as well.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you so much to all our panelists. We're actually at time now. I feel like I'm going to beg 1 minute more from our audience. And while Tim pops a couple of the links in the chat, we also had a previous webinar on fauna recovery and learning the lessons about fauna recovery. So Tim, if you can quickly pop that one in the chat. I'm going to give the last word to Ollie, I think, just to come back, because there's been a lot of comments in the Q&A about just, you know, the terrible things that I guess, you know, European practices have done to this landscape, the degradation, and really the need to be guided by and hear and listen to Indigenous approaches over the long term, you know, which have adapted to many climate changes, to many extremes in the landscape. But to do that well is going to be a challenge going forward. So where do you think we're at with, you know, has it changed since the Black Summer fires, and what are our prospects for doing this well, for walking together well into the future?
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. Yeah, I think things have changed, and not just the bushfires, but COVID. And I think a growing awareness around the need for action on climate change. I think as a society, as a global community, people are starting to, I think, realise that we are all connected, that we live in a holistic, you know, ecosystem that, you know, traditionally we call country, everything that exists in your world, you know, and as our world gets bigger, our relationships to country can grow as well. And I think the bushfires have really kind of, I think, taught us a really valuable lesson that you know, isn't a new lesson, is that if you don't look after country, you know, you learn the way the law works, you know, and it's pretty harsh. It's a pretty harsh kind of lesson to learn. And if you think about it in a kind of, in another context where we don't have the communication systems and we don't have all the infrastructure and technology that we have now, you know, these fires would have been so devastating. They would have wiped out so many people's livelihoods across. And this, when we look at some of the size of these fires, we're talking like whole language groups. We're talking about genocide of people, essentially, in some of these areas. And that's really, you know, really stark kind of lesson to learn, that, you know, the plants, the animals, the people, the kinship in these places has just been so devastated. So it's a real wake up call for us, you know. And I think the bright side of it is that there is an opportunity here to come together and actually learn together. And we've talked a lot about some of these challenges of colonisation and the lack of capacity often and capability in many communities, not just Aboriginal communities, in many places there's a need for growth. But I think the one thing that traditional knowledge and cultural practice from First Nations people brings is a philosophy that we can all learn from, about connection to country, about the opportunities to care for country, and how country can be the provider of all that we need. And if we use those fundamental philosophies in our practice, in how we go about making all these decisions, I think we're going to make better decisions. And I think that's the unlearning process that we need to go through. We need to kind of decolonize our minds from not just the colonial legacies of governments and invasions that have happened to all our ancestors. Everybody, doesn't matter where you come from, people have been colonized. But we also see that within institutional frameworks as well. And people within those frameworks also often feel oppressed. So it's about how do we actually empower each other to decolonize, to de-learn the things that don't work for us and focus on the things that do, which is connection and supporting each other to learn and being able to get out there and actually achieve the things that matter. That's what supports people. Everyone feels good about that connection and being able to see things grow and things, you know, respond, and whether it's in environmental context or a social or economic context, it's all one thing. It's about how living systems evolve and support each other. And so fire taught me that. Fire is a teacher of law. It's one of the most fundamental factors in being able to manage land. You know, we learned to make fire with our hands. We learned that from the lightning, our ancestors. We learned from the birds, you know, and look what happens when we forget that knowledge. The landscape burns, you know. And so we've got an opportunity. Hopefully people will understand that if we look to that connection, that kinship, that story of place that has driven First Nations people's ways of being and doing for millennia, if we look to that for support, we have a pathway. And the same pathway that old people tread when they walked up to the Bunya Mountains and they shared the nuts and they walked back again, they burnt the bristlebird pathways. you know, like there's all these connections that actually are like spiritual and cultural relationships of people over the country that mean that things exist and things can exist because people have those connections. And that's all we need to understand. We just have to play our part, and we'll be stronger together.
Okay. Thank you. Lovely way to end. So thanks to all our audience for sticking with us, and we will send around a recording for you to share with others in your networks, in your agencies, in your friendship groups and community organisations, so that hopefully we can keep the conversation going.